You're listening to Wisdom of the Ages, the show that taps into the many expressions of universal, ancestral, and personal wisdom to ignite evolutionary consciousness.
Are you ready to lean back into the wings of wisdom and be carried by a higher source? Then tune in with me and get ready for a wild and magical ride. Throughout the ages, wisdom has been shared in the form of stories and poetry. And wisdom can also be found when we share authentically with each other. On this show, we're going to be speaking to many wisdom teachers, authors, free thinkers, and disruptors of reality. And perhaps we might come away with a precious jewel of wisdom. Before I introduce my guest, Tanya Dawn Rekla, I'd like to share a bit of bardic wisdom with you. It comes from my book, Legends of the Grail, Stories of Celtic Goddesses. It takes about 30 seconds. But it's from the first page, and it's about Skyach, an ancient warrior goddess from Scotland who reminds me of Tanya. You see, you had to visit Skyach in the ancient days if you wanted to find your superpowers. So, this is a bit about her in her own voice. My name is Skyach, and I am a warrior woman of the Isle of Skye. I can read a man's future, even when he is 100 miles away, thinking that he would like to battle me. Even now they see me, hoping I will teach them the way of the spear, the blade, the staff and rope. But they focus too much on material objects and forget the world of spirit, which is where I can send them. Yes, I connect people with the light, but often in ways they did not expect. So, speaking of disruptors of reality, I want to introduce my guest, Tanya Dawn Rekla. The Executive Director of Superpower Experts, Tanya believes everyone has the power to create a multi-dimensional existence and master the human experience. She likes to challenge the way that people journey through consciousness. And she says that superpowers only develop with reliability and usefulness when someone moves through the evolved consciousness or their personal power and starts to explore the abstract frequency or synergistic collaboration. So it was after hearing this and speaking to Tanya that I became excited and decided I had found my tribe. So I'm here to explore superpowers and wisdom with you. Welcome, Tanya.
Oh, thank you so much. I am so incredibly excited. I can't get enough of your stories and your reading, and it's so exciting. Thank you for sharing that, and what an honor to be compared to such an amazing, pivotal figure. Thank you.
So I always like to start with this one question, which is, what wisdom do you share with the world?
Beautiful. I think you did such an amazing job of encapsulating that. And when I really stepped into the guidance I was being given, and mind you, there was resistance, folks. I don't pretend that any of this was easy or normalized for me when the friction still existed with it. But as I relaxed into it, in retrospect, I can see clearly, right? There's a beautiful, brilliant design in it all. And ultimately, if I have to encapsulate it into a soundbite, I hold people accountable to their highest frequency. And a lot of times that means introducing concepts like their abilities and reframing things that perhaps they've seen as challenges in their existence as a true gift and an insight or clue into what they chose to do here in the world and what they've agreed to. And then holding them accountable to it, right? And making sure that it's being done not to fulfill the ego or to fulfill some sort of accomplishment of the personhood, but recognizing that until we're really willing to dissolve into oneness, the abstract frequency or this concept, you named it, of synergistic collaboration, then those powers are, parlor tricks at best. And they will fail us, and they do destruction. And a lot of times they wield more destruction for the person wielding them. They yield more destruction for the person wielding them than they do to anybody else. But we will take people down with us if we're not careful. And there are a lot of people awakening at this time and coming into these powers and sensing them, and they think they're going crazy, or they don't know what to do, or they've been destructive with them. And we have way too many stories in our collective consciousness that tell us it's super scary, and it's not safe to step into those spaces. And, crucifixion stories, witch burning stories, right? Drowning, like we've got them all. And so part of the work in holding people accountable is also making sure that we're creating safe spaces for them to explore them and to master them and to be with them, which is not any different than what's been happening for centuries and eons in tribal aspects. This just feels like a little bit more of a transparent process than perhaps the mystery schools or the secret societies of old ever shared with the world.
Well, that's really interesting. So I wonder if the mystery schools held a person, I would say in the Bardic Ovate Druid tradition, and also probably the Kabbalistic tradition too, that people would be held in a body of wisdom until they somehow integrated that material. Let's say, if you're working with the Kabbalistic tradition, you might suddenly understand the 10 Sephirotic energies and how the divine works through you. So you build enough of a vessel to handle the divine, to handle the lightning bolt, that Skayach actually also knew how to work with. But would you say that it's important to develop our vessel, our ego, so that it's not a limitation, but actually is integrated enough so that it becomes this precious pearl, this really our personal power? So do we need to develop this personal power before we start playing in a big way?
Well, we contend that you absolutely do. And the way that we describe it is, everybody understands the hero's journey, right? Thanks to Carl Jung, and that's the trajectory that most of us assume that we're on. And you see examples of it throughout history. We liken that to kind of climbing your own mountain, right? Well, the challenge is that we have a lot of people that either summited their mountain or are very close. And there hasn't been a lot of dialogue about, okay, what next, right? What comes after that? Is there something that comes after that? And in retrospect, we can see that in and of itself is just a construct that we built, right? This idea of seeking and the quest, and that's your whole space. But what comes after the quest, right? What comes after when the hero gets self-actualized? And that dialogue, I think, is what's really unfolding now. And it's different than what I think a lot of people thought, because the idea is like, you learn on your journey, like it's your journey, like it's really just between you and the divine. Like there's really no one else can walk your journey for you. Some people can walk beside you, perhaps just for a time. And we learn a lot in that process. But what happens is that because that information is so extremely readily available now, and the collective consciousness in and of itself has matured and grown into it, there's like this natural tendency people have to kind of stagnate themselves close to that summit or mastery, because they don't know what comes next, right? And when faced with ambiguity, oftentimes we don't really want to move forward, right? Like, what is this thing and where are we going? For whatever reason, I was well armed this lifetime with tools and knowingness that allowed me to keep going. And so, we tell people it's once you summit that mountain of mastering your own personal power, now it's time to walk up that mountain and start doing your work in the world, right? Whereas before it was like, I think we just kind of adopted this notion that the only thing you can do there is stay on your mountain and wait for people, the onesies and twosies, that kind of come up your mountain and teach to them. Well, then we have the internet and social media, and all of a sudden our global world got so much smaller. And it's like, well, what do you do here? Like, people, it looks like they found me on the top of my mountain, so they must be able to do everything the way I did it. But that's not necessarily true anymore, because we're broadcasting in really different ways than was ever possible before. And so now we have to look at, if you're in that mastery, like, who are your people to assist? How are you going to assist them? How do you keep from making it about you, right? In the personhood and the ego. And how do you do that in kind of, how do we take this growth journey now out of the individual now into more of like the tribal or community aspect before we're able to kind of get it to a mass adoption phase? Well, that means looking at business models. It means looking at things that have worked in the past. It means looking at ways of being from the past that were built around this single persona concept, which was all of the human potential folks that paved the way here. All of the spiritual teachers were individual. Well, why? And what happened? Do we need that still? And that's what we see a lot in the social media kind of personal branding conversations. Everybody's trying to carve out a personal individual space for themselves, and it's not working. And very few people are willing to call that out. And there's, because they've built their lifetimes on it, right? They've made a lot of money teaching people how to build that kind of a model, only for those individuals to be really frustrated now because we don't need that anymore. Now we need to know how to work together. Well, how do you maintain yourself and your actualization in the company of other people? And that's a whole other layer. We call it the superhero journey, right? It's moving out of the personhood and into more of the collaboration.
So I need to ask you, is there a website that people can go to find out more about you?
Absolutely. I am all things superpowers at superpowerexperts.com. You can go there. You can take a quiz on our homepage to find out your superpowers. You can drop down menu in the About section. You can go to my page directly or my show, Disrupt Reality. But you can find me there. That's pretty much everywhere, or the only place people need to go to find out what I'm all about. So I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, listen, we just need to take a quick break and then we're going to go back onto the quest. So today we're talking with Tanya Dawn Rekla about the wisdom of the ages. And when we come back from this break, we're going to discuss more about superpowers, about quests, and all sorts of things. So this is Ann-Kate Sullivan, and you can learn more about me on www.wisdomoftheages.superpowerexperts.com. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Hello, everyone. This is Tanya Dawn Rekla, Executive Director of Superpower Experts, and we want to thank each of you for making Superpower Up the #1 podcast network for personal development and spiritual growth. Because people like you have the courage to say that mindfulness, healthy living, disrupting reality, the pursuit of consciousness, responsible entrepreneurship, and radical parenting matter, we now amass over 1 million downloads monthly in more than 90 countries. Our numbers keep growing because there are far more people willing to live divergently than mass media wants to acknowledge. For you, the change makers, the light bearers, the way showers, we say thank you. If you're ready to take the next step in your evolution, go now to superpowerexperts.com and take the Superpower Quiz. And as Neva Lee Rekla, our youngest podcaster, likes to remind us, remember, we all have superpowers and we can change the world.
So we're back. You are listening to the Wisdom of the Ages podcast with Ann-Kate Sullivan, and you can find out more about me on www.wisdomoftheagessuperpowerexperts.com. So we are speaking with Tanya Dawn Rekla, the Executive Director of Superpower Experts. So Tanya, I'm excited about the quest, and I'm also want to thank you for co-creating with me and convincing me that a podcast is a way authors and free thinkers can play in the world. So I do think it's a great way to build relationship and share wisdom.
Well, I'm just so excited you said yes. Like I feel like we win in this scenario. Like this show and your depth of knowledge and wisdom in this space is so needed right now. One of the first times you and I talked about, the Bard traditions and just the depth of work that goes into developing yourself before you're able to call yourself like an expert or something like that. And we butted up against that with the whole superpower experts concept and the idea that we are all experts in our own journey, right? And that's the goal, to get there. Like it's ours and ours alone. And then together we make up this really powerful community of people that don't have to be perfect, because we have things like transparency and accountability and integrity and all of these things worked in. And so you really fill a beautiful, beautiful space within this container to make sure that we're not losing what so many people worked so hard to help us understand. And I think it's a shame when we take the superficial route and we don't dig a little bit more deeply. And so I can't thank you enough for bringing that to this community. So thank you.
Well, I have to say it's a shift. When I've spent 35 years writing books and giving lectures and not really engaging in technology the way that my children do. And so when you invited me on the show, there was a pause. There was definitely a pause because I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to learn something. I'm going to have to learn to dance in an entirely new way. And so I had to really check in with my guidance to see if Is it true in this age that wisdom can be shared in the form of a podcast or something like this? Because there's just a lot of podcasts. It's just chatting. It's just chatting. There's not a lot of depth or wisdom. And when I connected to you and your tribe, I went, oh my gosh, I think actually we're at a time where this really can happen. I actually believe we're in a consciousness revolution and people are hungry for the information. And so I think it's a great play.
Yeah. Well, you were really, you came in at a really beautiful time, because when we first started, it was just my show, and it was like God and I had a number of chats on this one, because I was like, I'm sorry, you want me to do what? Like, no, thanks. I don't need to hear myself talk. Thanks anyway. And I knew what a red ocean the whole podcasting community had become, and it was hard to get traction. And so when we finally got to where we were guided to check the stats, and we know people are hungry for this, because we over 1 million downloads a month is unheard of, and we've never ever veered off course. We speak in our way, in our frequencies, about our topics. Like, we don't sacrifice that for anything, because we were told the consequences if we chose to do that, right? There's no easy way out for us. And so we know people are interested. And so for that to kind of happen at the same time that you were starting to orbit around us, it was just this beautiful package of like, wait a second, can we build a bridge here? Right. And can we build a bridge there? And so kudos to you for having the courage to even ask your own guidance if that was a place to play in, because it's just weird enough that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
It's true. Well, a lot of this information was only shared in mystery schools for a long time. Anybody who was working on direct connection with the divine, anybody who was using alchemy to take their limited persona, their their limited self, and do enough magic and alchemy to integrate into a precious pearl, into somebody who really could share something larger with reality. Because you have to start to realize there are these other structures. There's a soul. There's a soul. And in fact, there are about 5 levels of soul. And we have to be able to lean back into them. And then once we start creating from that place, that's magic. That really is. That's all of a sudden there's this alchemy, because we're not operating off this limited persona that says, no, you can't do this. No, you can't share this. No, you can't. All of a sudden it's like, yes, actually, from the place from the voice of the world soul, you can actually experience and express anything.
Yeah, we call that, when people find their home frequency, that's when they get to really start to build. Everything prior to that is their quest, right? I mean, there's, sometimes I've referred to it as like their big kahuna, because I've seen it as this like energy wave that has this perfect like meeting place in time and space, only if you're positioned in the right frequency to ride it. And most of us have this sense of questing, like it's driving us, right? Mine was just on hyper overload. Like, I tell the story all the time of when Justin and I were dating, and he looked at me one day, like, can I just not grow, or can we just not grow today? And I'm like, no, I have to keep going, And it was just always this like, you have to get there. And I remember the moment I got there, and I can't even tell you what it means, but other than I just breathed for the first time in my life, right? I just was able to exhale for the first time. It's like, okay, now we get to work. And it's like, well, what the hell have I been doing? But it was like, it was just a different thing, It was like, one was the quest to get there, and then the building happens, and it's at this beautiful culmination point, like you're speaking to. And I will tell you, just to lean credence into like what you're saying, we now purposely do not share certain pieces of information unless people are held in one of our programs, because what we found was exactly why these mystery schools and these sacred communities never, ever, ever shared it outside of that container, because we cannot hold it as individuals. We can't do it. It is too disturbing, too alarming. We've seen people crash and burn. We have huge lessons learned in this. And so, I, for one, am very, very, very vocal about taking really big responsibility when you're playing in these spaces. And I think, unfortunately, the internet and social media has that kind of dark side of allowing for this like dispersion of information, and it's doing damage to people. And so if we're not willing to speak to everything that came before, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, we are standing on the shoulders of those who have traversed it and who've given us the eons of knowledge. And we have a responsibility to carry forward what needs to be carried forward. And there was a reason for that level of secrecy. And it's not what people think. Like, we can go into conspiracy theory about it and be like, oh, it's been withheld and everything else. It's like, no, it's just like, the divine will give you all the power that you can carry, but only when you're able to carry it. Otherwise, you'll just die, you'll implode or what. I'm not sure what happens if you burst into fragments. I don't know how it works, but for sure, we've seen diseases and mental illnesses and people taking themselves out because it's just too disturbing, right? Like, there's a reason we wake up slowly. And if we don't honor that and respect that process and really truly integrate and embody it, our biggest challenge is with people who come to us who think they've done a fair amount of development. And it's like this, yeah, I know all this, I know all this, I know all this. It's like, great, but are you living this? How's your life look? Like, if the projection that you see isn't ideal and utopian for you, then you're probably not embodying the concepts quite as much as you think you are. And you have to be willing to say, wait, what if? What if there's more for me to learn here? And that's challenging to the ego, especially for the very learned, studious or those who possess some pretty high level powers. Most of those people achieve success in a single kind of silo. And they don't realize that, yes, while that may be transferable into other areas, you have to do that work, and you have to do it in the spaces that aren't as comfortable for you. So I love that you hit this point of like, wait a second, this doesn't feel like I know what I'm doing. Like, I've done this enough. Like, what am I talking about? Like, why would I want to become a student of something new when, you have a pretty cush gig going on there? Like your stuff and your processes and how to disseminate material in that way. So to encourage people out of that space when they remember the painful process of learning everything before and say, hey, what if you could do this in a little bit of a different way? So allowing to hold both the teacher and the student kind of archetypes simultaneously creates a really rich experience for people to keep evolving and growing, even as they are being leaders or masters in a particular area. But we just don't often speak about that level of complexity or contradiction.
Absolutely. I mean, how can you really call yourself a wisdom leader if you're not involved in ongoing inquiry and learning something new every day? And, I think for
unfortunately, a lot of them don't.
Well, it might be true, but it's a good idea. It might be a good idea to keep learning and growing. Because the thing is this, I think a really important question we always have to ask every day. My husband and I do this every day. Is we ask each other, are we ego identified right now? Are we really identified with the family? It's like a case of mistaken identity. Are we engaging in some kind of reality that's not really truly us? Or
doesn't have to be us. Yeah.
Right. Or are we engaged in something, or are we engaged with essence? Are we engaged with the higher self that's actually free? There's a part of us that's already free. But like you said, when you start to engage in those worlds, that massive world, when you lean back into it, you actually sort of dissolve. And I think that's where a lot of stuff will kick up, because you go, well, wait a second, I'm incarnated to have a persona. What about me? I'm important, right? Oh, I'm not.
Can I have
the
things I want? Isn't it okay for me to want things? Neva's so cute, because our question in our house is, who are you being right now? And when you have trouble answering that question, like that's a good indicator, because the ego doesn't want to acknowledge it. And Neva's so cute. She'll be like, after time she'll get going on a story or something. She'll look at me in the middle and go, or maybe that's just a story I'm writing. I'm like, cool, write the story, but at least know that you're writing it. Don't be consumed by it. And or she'll come to me and say, is it okay that I'm kind of sad about this? And I said, well, what are you actually asking me? Because of course it's okay. Are you asking me, is it necessary? Are you asking me, is your sadness a selfish reaction here of you trying to control things? Like, what is the real question underlying that? And get to the heart of it, right? And those are just dialogues that she's grown up in. So she has a lot of internal processes to work through them in ways that a lot of us weren't taught as children. I grew up in an amazing house, very intellectual, very well supported. But this stuff is just different, right? We just haven't been talking about this stuff for that long, at this level of consciousness. And so it's worthy to just say, okay, it's okay if you don't know. And there does hit a really beautiful point where, you really don't have to go into the ego first and battle it through. And what really did it for me was the very clear, guys, when I finally acquiesced in all this and just surrendered and stopped resisting, that's when the real blueprint came forward. And there were all of these things, like everybody has to be able to evolve, including the business. Everybody has to be replaceable. Everybody has to be able to leave, and preferably to leave in love. Like, it's like all these things to try to work into a business model, right? Where we haven't, seen that before. And so when I started hearing those things, it was like, we have to take a look at this. Like, why would we not allow people to keep evolving? Well, the current employee model it's a risk to the business if people evolve, because they might leave. And so now the business has invested time and money into that person only to have them go anywhere. Okay, great. Like, we get that, but is the answer to try to hold people back? Like, no, that doesn't work. It becomes toxic anyway. So what if we could craft a model where everybody gets to be fluid and in motion, and the model was robust enough to allow for that level of evolution and for people leaving? Like, we have exit strategies built into every single one of our programs at different phases, because people have to know how they're going to leave, right? There's nothing worse than signing on to a training or coaching program and you're like, do I do this till I die? Like, what if I want to leave? Like, what if I don't want to be married to this person? And so we acknowledge, like, this is a lifelong commitment, but that commitment is not to us. That's to the divine. That's to your relationship with that higher aspect of who you are, and how it communes with the collective knowingness. That's yours and yours alone to carry. Like, we will never accept you abdicating that to us. We're happy to hold it for a period as you get comfortable holding that, but we're always constantly trying to hand it back to you. And that's the same technique that we use in our parenting. And we're very open with Neva about it. Like, we will give you as much as you can hold. And we're happy for you to abdicate into us when you don't know how to, but we will always be trying to give it back, at least in pieces and parts, to help strengthen your ability to hold more and more, right? Well, who talks that way, right? Nobody has those conversations, but these are the conversations that we're having.
Mm-hmm. They're important conversations to have, and I think the children that are coming in these days are programmed for something entirely new. This shift, this consciousness shift. So they come in understanding. First of all, they seem to understand technology. They understand that we do have to work in harmony with each other, with some sort of synergistic connection. And also, it seems to me that religion has actually, in a lot of cases, even though I love wisdom traditions, a lot of times wisdom traditions can actually ultimately bind you. So you have to know when to step outside of a religious structure also, and make your own direct connection. And I think something is also true with business. And it might be that, as we continue to evolve, that business is actually one of the main arenas in which wisdom can really play out, in which, relationship can play out in a win-win level. Because, I mean, first of all, if we're gonna turn around this sort of ecological crisis that's going on, we're gonna have to learn how to work with solar, wind, and plant trees, and we're gonna have to just start to be a little different in the way that we're operating. And it seems to be happening. I mean, look at the billions of trees that are being planted.
Well, I think it's really important to give voice, because I know some of you are listening going, no, it's not happening. The world still sucks and da-da-da-da. I really do contend that what we're seeing is people giving voice to their versions of reality at different dimensions and frequencies. And we have to accept that, because what happens is that I believe, in everything that I've shown and been shown and everything that I see, is that those disasters, those apocalyptic kind of situations that we're so good at voicing in social media actually are occurring for a lot of people. It's I was asked a few years ago by someone, and they asked, do I really think that we're going to see this shift in consciousness into this kind of new world in our lifetime? And I remember kind of looking at her with this confused dog look, and I was like, I already see it. Like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And it was super confusing until it dawned on me that there really is a threshold that you cross, and you have to be willing to look something in the face and deny its existence. And so on some level, our belief that things are improving and that 1 million downloads a month, over 1 million downloads a month on this network means that people care and that they're taking action and that they're doing things differently. Like, on some level, our belief makes it so. And we have to be willing to see it. The challenge is that left to our own devices, we also will find all kinds of things that will contradict it. And so you have to be okay hearing from the collective that, no, wait, these things are still happening, even when you're looking around going, Am I just naive? Like, am I Pollyanna-ish? Do I just have on rose-colored glasses? And it's like, yeah, maybe, but it takes courage to craft a new reality, right? And so just by us opening up the dialogue of, our superpowers real, we created the potentiality for them to be so. That takes a real high degree of confidence in your ability to walk the world, to entertain the idea that you're now talking about dimensionality. And what happens in one dimension doesn't happen in another. And we knowingly created a multidimensional organizational structure, which means that if you ask 10 people within the organization what the organization does, you may get 10 different answers. And it doesn't mean that we're not clear in our messaging or we don't know what we're doing. It means that it's designed to offer those playgrounds at many, many different frequencies. Most businesses are unidimensional. They offer one single playground, but people don't realize like that's temporary. And I want to talk about that a second, because what we've seen is that our egos, our personhood, that persona is so incredibly smart, and it's learning right alongside you. So every process that you come upon, every new modality, everything that you use to kind of help with your growth is useful for you to get you to the next phase, but you have to be willing to let it go, because the persona, the personhood, will then take it and use it to keep you there in that new space. If you're not willing to continually upgrade your processes and continually let them go, like integrate them and move on, integrate them and move on. We tried this early on with Neva. In the beginning, she would go to anger. She was really little, like she would just get to anger, right? And a lot of it was she was trying to figure out how to like be in this constricted, like little infant body, right? It was like, what, and at the point in time when she could speak and we were able to really communicate with her about some complex conversations, probably about 3 or 4, maybe even at 2, we started her with this. And we were able to be like, okay, what's under the anger, right? Well, keep it at sad, because she'd gotten sad about something. And instead of wanting to feel sad, she went right to anger, right? Which, we just look at adults and you can see that tendency, right? And so we're like, so the process for her in that moment was keep it at sad. And she was super resistant to it initially, didn't want to feel the feeling of it. And, but over time she did, and she mastered it, right? And she could keep herself from going to anger by just being like, okay, my feelings are hurt. Like my heart is sad right now, is one of the kind of sayings that we offer to her. And then it wasn't very long after that where I was like, okay, well, what's under sad? And she's like, well, you told me to keep it at sad. I'm like, I get it, but what provoked the sadness? And it was, some sort of fear, right? This fight or flight thing that got kicked up. And she's like, well, I don't want to look at that. You told me to keep it at sad. I'm like, yeah, but you mastered that. Now we have to go deeper, right? She's like, what? Like, you can't keep changing the rules on me. And it's like, yeah, you have to, right? You have to continually upgrade those processes, because of course her ego had taken hold of it. And now sad was crafted, right? It became this fake emotion that she was throwing around so that she didn't have to get any deeper than that. And so so it was this continual process of peeling back the layers. And you can't say that was total programming, because she was so young. Like she hadn't been through 20 years of experience, 30 years, 40 years on this planet to build up all of these traumas and stuff. So it was coming in, she was moving it for the collective. She was teaching us, like, all of those elements were at play. And it was undeniable, because this very, very, very young person, by typical standards, was able to practice these and use them and master them. So she's one of those, like, kind of, you got to face it, folks, that there are ways that we can do this work, but most of us have built up so much resistance. But that's why these things have to be fluid, right? This is why, like, if you adopt a modality and you stay in it, and a lot of times people stay in it because their livelihood is connected into it, right? And the fear of poverty or losing out or whatever keeps them peddling something that really no longer serves them and has kind of done what it was designed to do. But try explaining that to somebody who built a multi-million-dollar platform on top of a persona that they no longer fit into, right?
Exactly.
Disaster happens. And that's what we're seeing with some of these WOA showers, some of these people who paved these conversations, like, total gratitude to them. But when we turn off the recording on my show, most of them will admit to feeling a little bit lost right now and not knowing how to transfer all of this knowledge and wisdom into what comes next. And that to me is a tragedy, because it means we're going to lose a lot of that wisdom if we're not careful.
Well, I think that's what this show is. I'm hoping what this show is about how to keep our direct connection. And there are many paths to understanding how to do that. And, you have your particular path, which is beautiful. And I hope people will go check it out. And, let's say, in terms of, say, the Kabbalistic tradition. And one thing I love about that is that the first 40 years of your life is spent building up an ego. So you're not even really supposed to work on your spiritual life. This is really about who are you as an individual? How do you function in relationship? How do you make money? How do you master all your drives, your survival drive, your social drive, your sexual drives? How do you work in these drives in a way that that works within the community context? So that we spend about 40 years doing that. We really need about 400 years to get this down, So hopefully our lifetime will increase. But and then we have from 40 on. That's usually when these other questions start arising. And and unfortunately, a lot of our wisdom traditions, we've been cut off from nature and the body, the feminine. I think this has been a crime really against humanity. And it might be part of the slavery model, who knows, but I won't go into the conspiracy stuff. But the thing is, if we really keep our body, if we really stay connected to our body and our heart and our soul, then we really can lean back in a way. I think it's actually quite safe, but you can lean back into this greater wisdom. And so, yes, you're still an individual. You're still a precious pearl because you've built that up over a long period of time. Yes, you know what you can do, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. And, we have to focus on both. We're building up where our weaknesses are, and we're running with our strengths. But that's why we're continual students. We're always learning. We're learning from each other. And you have particular skills and gifts that I don't have, and I would love to learn them from you. And hopefully I've got some things to share with you too. And it's so how fun, when we can come not from that the limited, fearful ego, and that's when we're going to enter into drama and fighting, but really from that higher space when we can lean forward and take each other's hands and go, come on, the earth's in a little bit of crisis here. Let's see. What do we create now? How do we create this next new level of reality, which I absolutely believe we can do?
Well, and it's moving people out of being consumers into creators. It's we work off of, and for those of you listening who run businesses or involved in businesses, some of it's just sticking to your guns and saying, we don't engage in anything unless it's a win-win-win solution. And that means putting the divine first. If it's good for the collective good, and we believe that we get clear guidance on that, then it's good for me and it's good for you. We don't do anything that's just good for me or just good for you or even just good for us, because that's where we got a lot of the whole real gross, toxic kind of underhanded business dealings things that happen. You have to put the divine first, because ultimately, I will tell you folks, it always fails, right? One world is death and decay and disease and dying, and the other world is life. So if you create an agreement in the world that doesn't involve some aspect of the divine, it is set to die every single time. The only way we breathe life into it is in those win-win-win scenarios. And that's the synergistic collaboration conversation of just knowing that the energy between us creates, right? It's not about what I want. It's not about what you want. It's about having the courage to come together and let the divine speak. And that's how I think I'd love to hear from your words. And I think you should share with the audience, one of those first strategy conversations that we had, and who came forward and who was present, and the process that we went through to really hear how this show wanted to develop. I just love that story. If you want to share a moment of it.
Well, I think there were a few different levels of leaning in. And when I'm connecting to the divine, so I'm an author mostly, and I've written about 13 books. And I don't write in the normal way, where you're supposed to have an outline, all of this. What I literally do is I connect to a guide, or I connect to the divine. And depending on what sort of information is coming through, I'm going to connect in a different place, because we are multidimensional beings. And so, I read a little bit about Skaya, and she's a deity that I can connect to, and I can hear her voice and bring through those messages. But it might be that I'm working with the universal soul, in which case I might sort of lean back and feel something that's really vast that might not even have a voice or a face. And that's what started happening when you and I were talking. I believe the first deity that came through was Danu, who's a really lovely Celtic deity and one of my guides. And she's one of the original mother goddesses, and she's been chatting to me in dreams and so forth in my meditations because she's concerned about the earth, and so she wants me to speak and write about it. And so not only when we sort of invited her in, did she show up, but I was smelling roses. And that's usually a confirmation for me that yes, Spirit's with us. And
it was so much fun.
Yes, it really is. And it's so fun to dance too, because some people go, am I crazy? Did I just go crazy? And it's so fun.
Probably.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, we're talking about shifting paradigms. So there's one paradigm that's culture of death, and there's one paradigm that's culture of life. Danny's functioning out a culture of life paradigm. Mm-hmm. And so we can feel like we're going a little crazy when we're starting to connect to these deities and energies and multidimensional universes, because it's a little bit unfamiliar in the beginning. Over time, you build relationships and you go, oh, okay, yes, I know you. It's just like building a friendship. And so to work with wisdom traditions in this way does really require being willing to open to the mythic or poetic imagination. And that's why from the past 35 years, I've really worked with wisdom traditions in the literary realms, because since, who knows, the past 10,000 years, we've been carrying wisdom along through story and poetry. So we've been carrying it along in those forms, which is, we started talking about having a show where that might be happening. And
we had such a blast.
Yes. Well, share what you were feeling.
Oh, that's the story. That's the one that I was like, it was such a magical experience. And in all of the strategy conversations that we hold for our shows, there was some element of the divine that comes through. But what was so magical in yours was that the names and the faces and the personas that came forward were really clear. And this is as much for them as it is for us and the listeners, in the sense of, early on in my show, I had a number of channelers who came on and who channeled on the show. And then recently, like Paul Sella came on and channeled. And it was so bizarre. It was like word got out in the ether that there was this broadcast mechanism where you didn't have to have a body to be able to speak, right? And it was like, oh, cool, yeah, okay, you want to talk to? Sure, absolutely. We have an audience you can talk to. And so the energy, the excitement, the kind of, I'll call it friction, but not in a negative sense, just the lighting up, the activation that happens when we open ourselves up to the fact that it's not quite what we think it is, right? The entities and beings are around us all the time, and we get to choose, in our house, in our construct, God is our CEO. Like, I'm a CEO on paper, but ultimately it's like, there's someone else calling the shots, and when we learn to relax into that and to seek guidance in that way, everything was just easy. Right? It's just, we don't make decisions. We just lean into the guidance, right? We just listen and we take the pauses, and it gets faster and faster, and you get more and more confident in what you're hearing. But you always have to have those kinds of checks and balances to make sure that you're on point, because so much of what all of us have been programmed with is normalized in a really different way. And so to normalize things like, talking with God, or, activating divine entities, or communing, or building relationships with people that don't have bodies, or entities that don't have bodies. It's like, what are we talking about here, really? And part of the guidance for the show was to provide a safe space for all of these brilliant people who are having these kind of out of the norm experiences and don't really feel like they can talk about it in their actual lives. Most of the people come on the show like, oh my gosh, I never get to have these conversations. I'm like, oh, I always have these conversations. These are the only conversations I have. But it wasn't always that way. Certainly I was a soldier, a counterintel agent. Like, all of us have these stories of the practical piece of us, how we were reared and programmed before we were able to step into this. And then what we're seeing with the younger generations are they're not going to have those stories. They're shifting everything. But because of our work, because of what we're doing, we're creating for them potentialities that didn't exist when a lot of us were coming up in the world. So it's this beautiful synchronistic tapestry that when you can get a high enough vantage point, it makes a lot of sense. It just doesn't make sense from kind of normal traditional society perspectives.
Well, if you're seeing the world with only your five senses, then it might seem a little crazy. But it started to shift for me when I literally went questing. I got an overseas research award to go to King's College London, and then I actually was supposed to go and collect folklore, and I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I think the universe had a big smile, and so I find
For
myself
sure.
right. I find myself walking in these fields I now know they're called the thin places. So there's some places in Ireland, particularly Ireland seems to be very, very active. But I just got back from Bohemia. It's pretty thin also, where you can really start to attune with these other realities. And I've spoken to so many people who say that they sat up against an old stone, kind of like Outlander, the TV series where, you've fallen into this other dimension. And they went, somebody told me about the stars and I heard them singing, these different experiences. And so we can get together and go, yes, we're starting to understand that these multidimensional universes are real, that there are many, many different levels. And, understanding a structure, like if you follow the Celtic tradition or say the Kabbalistic tradition, understanding those structures of reality means that your mind can relax to go, oh, okay, we're operating in this wisdom paradigm. Okay, yes, I can overlap and have a chat with Merlin. That's just fine. So anyway, so over and it has been 35 years of questing. It's not a new thing, but I learned to go into these ancient cairns and into these old places, the thin places, to these places, these old stone places, to places that are vortexes, and start to commune with the deities that were there. And that most of my Legends of the Grail series comes out of those conversations with Skaiach, the woman from the Isle of Skye, who seems to really like Tanya, and Danu, and some of them that are very, very loving. I only really seem to attract the ones that are really light-filled and love humanity, so that's quite a good thing. But over the years, I've learned to really trust them, and they're as real to me as any person that I know. In fact, in some ways, even more real, because I know that when this body-mind complex dissolves, as it will one day, the part of me that's essence, the part of me that's linked to the ancient wisdom, will live on, and I'll be with my friends in the other worlds. And so once I started to tap into that and realize that this is a never-ending story, first of all, I realized we can't really destroy this place because it's a never-ending story. So we can change it, we can alter it, but we might as well just align with something that's incredibly beautiful and powerful. God is an incredibly beautiful, powerful being, or I'm not even sure God's a being. Wisdom. I like using the word wisdom instead of God, just because God has religious connotations, whereas wisdom's pretty open. But it's the same thing. You're wandering around inside of the mind of this incredible scientist. And when
I do think that it's right? Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go
ahead. I was
ahead.
gonna say, I do think it's important to because in a lot of the spiritualism, religion's gotten such a bad rap, and I think that on some level I equate it to a technique that we use in our training, and it's the idea of to get people to trust what we call the cloud, right? So imagine like your mind is your own personal hard drive, and we're trying to get people to get that relying on and that identifying with and the decision-making process out of their own mind, because most people don't realize that as soon as you put information in your mind, it gets tainted with whatever's there and whatever you believe is possible and all these other things. It's not true information. It's your memories, it's your interpretation of things. And so the more we can get people trained to keep it off of themselves, and we teach people to trust the cloud is what we call, like, trust the cloud, like it's there, infinite universal knowingness, you have access to it all times. But that's such an abstract concept. I think where things like religion and certain modalities and all of these other things, I've been playing with this concept for quite a while because the Christ concept is such a big one in our backgrounds, and that was kind of our developmental journeys and part of my own personal journey. And so it's like, what is it and how do you relate this? Because it's easy to be like, well, religion did this and religion did that. But some of these constructs serve as a phenomenal external hard drive for people, right? So it's like we have to allow them to be what they are, not try to make them what they aren't. And when you cross that threshold into the world of life, you see the divine in everything. right? There's no more need to be discerning, be like, well, I don't like that, or that doesn't fit for me, or I don't agree with that. Like all of that goes away. Like I can sit in just about any environment and see the divine there, even the most absurd and the most wayward, if you will, that seemingly has nothing of value to offer me. That in and of itself becomes a self-protective measure. There's a time in our development where we need to be that discerning because we're just not able to not be swayed by it, right? It's just the friction is too easily drops us down into a lower frequency. Well, there is a place in this existence where you can just simply walk the world and be in the world, but not of it. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I can sit anywhere and see the divine's clear work in hand and all of it, and allow for my work in terms of expanding that and holding that and calling it out to come through me. I don't have to be that discerning anymore because I'm not that swayed by it. But that takes training. That takes the willingness to walk a very different path. And so I always know where people are sitting when they would, depending on what they kind of want to throw out. And it's important to say, look, this isn't the end all be all. However, you may very well feel called into a church environment to be of service there. It doesn't mean you in your ego, you get to go and be like, oh, you're doing all these things wrong and let me tell you how to fix them. No, bring the light, bring the love into the spaces where perhaps they're crying out for more of it. Be that in those spaces and stop thinking about yourself so damn much. You know, it's not really about you.
Yeah.
And so
I do think that this is an important point too, that the religious traditions have acted as frameworks for people, kind of like school. You're going to school and you're learning a particular set of morals. You're starting to understand yourself in a particular way, but you're a student. You're learning and you're being held as a parent would hold you. And then something, and a lot of times people call it the Christ consciousness or the Sophia consciousness or the Shekinah. Something happens where all of a sudden there's a light that goes on inside of you and you have a direct knowing. And once you have a direct knowing, you don't need the structure, the religious structures anymore. Or you might not need them as much, let's say. There might be times when you start to wobble where you might want to call on a wisdom tradition. And the wisdom traditions are there for that very reason. And so I don't think there's any reason to decry any of them. But I do believe that as we're evolving consciously, that the conversation becomes more and more about my direct connection with wisdom and what that means. And so, and again, that's what I'm really hoping to talk about on the show. And I'm so happy that you brought in the Christ consciousness and God, and because I think all of these, we can also talk about, I don't really want to get into where these have been more harmful, because that's also true. But again, when we're ready to bust out of our egg, when we're ready to bust out of our ego shell, we're ready to really fly as eagles. Sometimes we do get betrayed, or we feel betrayed in some way. And that's an impetus from the universe to go, fly. There's another level. Feel this impulse, feel this creativity, and fly with this.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, and it's so important that we trust ourselves in those moments. And, for some of you that was a divergence from wherever you were brought up, but I encourage you to recognize that you will be brought back into those spaces, or those spaces will be brought to you, because you have to reconcile that. If you left anywhere in anything less than love, you are journeying back to it in some capacity. Like you have to, archetypally or otherwise. It may not be the exact location, but we can't have that anymore. You don't get to stay in these higher echelon spaces, if you will, if you're carrying that sort of like history with something that hasn't been integrated, hasn't been clear. It doesn't mean you have to go back in and dive full head on again and drink the wine and eat the bread. Like if that's not your thing, don't do it. And if you have wounds anywhere in that, they will come back to you. And so be really cautious what you're writing off completely as being the devil, until you understand that this process is much, much, much bigger than any of us anticipated. And if you get brought back into it, you don't have to buy into all the stories and take on the persona you were when you were there before. You get to just be in it now as you are. And it's such a beautiful exchange.
It is really beautiful. I think it's always important to remember that devil has lived backwards So, when we get caught up in our
love it.
shadows and our dysfunctions, it's okay. We just have to turn around for a minute and say, okay, where have I become twisted? And let's get back into the culture of life again.
And love is always that frequency of love being held by the divine is always such a great place to go back to. I was offering someone some advice a couple days ago, and it's, if when you're in indecision, just take a pause and say, okay, what do I know to be true? When I'm faced with all kinds of things that seem really illogical and don't make any sense, and I'm like, I'm not real sure what to do with all of this, I just take it back to facts and I go, okay, what do I know to be true? And I know myself to be an aspect of the divine in this world above all else. That's who I know myself to be, and that's what I've agreed to walk as. Everything else from that place makes a lot of sense to me. But when it goes back to our question, like, who are you being, right? And when you can't answer that, then you've probably been hijacked by some sort of fear aspect, and it's just worth taking a look at it. You don't need to judge yourself or anything else about it, but to make a decision from that place perpetuates something in the projection that you don't really prefer anyway. So you're better off taking that pause and saying, what if this can be different? What if this can look different, or show me how this can be different or look different? There's all kinds of methods for that. But again, I can't emphasize enough, like, stop running so fast when you have no idea where you're going, or even why you're doing it, right? Take those pauses, take those breaths, give the divine an opportunity to show you something new, and then have the courage to let go of your death grip on the atrocities and the victimization that you've suffered, and let it open up and heal through you, and then watch the magic unfold from there.
Yeah, because true nature really is pretty blissful. When we're really standing in the true nature, you understand that most of what we think of as real is a case of mistaken identity. Most of our family dramas, most of our upsets, all of this stuff is really just really a misunderstanding. And when we lean back into the field of love, and I'm actually feeling the field as you were talking about it. I'm really feeling the field of love holding both of us right now. It's interesting with the two of us talking about it. It's like the field can come in even more, and maybe the listeners are feeling it too. Just like right now, I think there are all these beings around us going, yes, please bring more love into the world. Please remember that you're always, always held in love. You're always held in wisdom. And that's where the deep peace is. And if we wake up just to this, right? Just wake up to this, we're going to have a revolution in consciousness.
Yeah. Well, and for those of you who are keen on the Bible and the gospel in particular, where two or more of you gather in my name, there also will I be. That synergistic collaboration, when we put the divine first, we get to access and benefit from all of that power and knowingness. Like, why in the world would you do anything but that? It's like every time I feel myself getting that in that small space, it's so incredibly uncomfortable anymore. Like, I don't hang out there very long anymore. And I have my checks and balances. I have the people who hold me accountable. And I think that that's really, really important, that you are willing to grow transparently in the presence of others, because otherwise we can fool ourselves into thinking we're all that, and the truth is, of course you are. And you're going to have your moments. Like, no individual can keep themselves out of that limited thinking exclusively without surrounding themselves. At least if you don't have people in actual bodies here that you can trust to do that, then you need to call on divine aspects to assist you with it, because you have to have that oversight. Otherwise, all the fears that you're working through and all the spaces that you're playing in will kind of lean you back into what you don't really want. And so there are all kinds of protocols and elements, which is, again, goes back to why this information was so closely held for so long. So don't mistake the fact that this is now available to you with the idea that it's easy, or that you should be able to just master it in one blog post reading. Like, it doesn't work that way. But it's good that we have access to information now, but the responsibility then lies on us to make sure that we know what's in resonance with our divine journey. And not abdicate that authority to people who shouldn't have it. And as I said before, there are ways to hold that for people as they're learning to hold it more for themselves. But if you're a coach or a practitioner, somebody out there doing this work, and you're not always trying to give that authority back to gently allow them, and you don't even know what I'm talking about, and you don't even know what that process looks like, then get yourself some additional training, because you're doing damage to people.
That's a good thing to we always need to question when we're actually helping and when we're actually hurting. And as you were talking, I was thinking about when I was growing up as a child, my grandmother was a Sunday school teacher, a Methodist Sunday school teacher. And one of the things I loved most about her, and I think the way I really started to get in touch with the Holy Ghost, and then sort of opened up from there, was that my mother and my grandmother and I would pray for people when they were ill. And what I noticed is that when, you said when two or more, but even three, when that third person, when the three of us gathered and we did a prayer for someone, the candle almost always would suddenly, the flame would suddenly grow bright and then go back to normal. And it was a sign to me that, look, because we collectively are praying for the goodness of somebody else. We've gathered in the name of love, something's happening. So I really believe in the power of prayer, and that collectively we can make a huge difference. So we've gone a long time here, and it's been so much fun. I could go on for another hour or so, but I think maybe we should start to call it a wrap. Maybe we can do this on another day, go into another level.
Absolutely. Well, this was such a beautiful taste, I think, for folks about what this show stands to do, and to bring people together and have these really deep conversations about wisdom traditions that maybe you don't always get to hear about, but certainly if you have heard about it, Ain brings with her this amazing wealth of knowledge and depth of resources that make it alive for you, and you can step into it, right? It's like opening a book and being able to step into the pages of it. That is my wish for you. If I could be so bold as to have a wish for anybody, it would be that you would open yourself up to that and lean into her as she creates this container with just a real richness to it, and relax into it. And I encourage you to go and check it out, wisdomoftheages.superpowerexperts.com. Make sure that you're going there and following her and just feeling it. If this is activating you at all and lighting you up, then she's speaking your language for you. So make sure that you follow her and the brilliant work that she's doing. And for you, I'm just so incredibly honored that you chose us, that you chose to journey with us, and that you're sharing that light and that wisdom in our community. And I can't thank you enough for it.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is just the beginning. I'm feeling very excited here. And your website is, again, for people who are listening,
superpowerexperts.com. Go to the homepage and take our quiz, so you can find out your superpowers and start walking that superhero journey.
So just before we close, I would like to end, as a good bard would, with a short poem that's in my book called The Windhorse Poems of Illumination. And I think it encapsulates a lot of what we were speaking about on this show. And it's called May I Play Again. I wish to free all that awaits within me to be born. May my limitations be washed away by a silent river. May I play again as a child in the ebbing and flowing currents of existence. I open my mouth to sing, yet feel ashamed for an instant. Who am I to have such a great longing? Please forgive me, but I wish to write this opera. I want to know my own life and how to move within it. I yearn to know God's immensity and how to mirror it without shattering. I sense that where I am closed and tight, I am yet untrue, and I want to unfurl so that no blossom within me is fruitless or withered, and no song is left unsung. So, until we meet again, may the wings of wisdom hold you in peace, protection, and love. This is Ain Kate Sullivan. Goodbye, and I'll win.
Are you ready to discover your superpowers? Go now to superpowerexperts.com and take the superpower quiz today.